Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Cooley, and I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the State Historical Museum. We are excited to announce that the Iowa History 101 webinar series will continue next year as the State Historical Society commemorates the upcoming 175th anniversary of Iowa's statehood in 2021. You can learn more about this series and all of our programming on our website at iowaculture.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you would like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live. All presentations will be recorded. But today we are going to learn about the holidays that Iowans celebrate during the cold winter months: Thanksgiving, Hanukkah, Christmas, and Kwanzaa. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Matt Beyer is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of the questions. Now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, State Curator Leo Landis. Leo has his Bachelor's of Science in History from Iowa State University and a Master's of Arts in Historical Administration from Eastern Illinois University. He has completed all but his dissertation towards a PhD in history from Iowa State. His museum experience includes time at Living History Farms in Urbandale, Conner Prairie in Fishers, Indiana, and 8 years as curator at Henry Ford Museum and Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan. He has also worked as a curator and director of education at Salisbury House in Des Moines. And now I'm very happy to turn it over to Leo to begin the webinar.
Well, thanks so much, Jennifer, and thank you to all of you for joining us today and anybody who watches this in the future. As Jennifer said, we're going to talk about four winter holidays, and Thanksgiving, our first one, is kind of fun to talk about. It really does come out of New England and some of those traditions that that most of us know, with the Plymouth colony and the relationship they had with the native peoples. And it then really becomes prominent as a day of fasting and prayer, really. General Washington, not yet president, declares a day of Thanksgiving. And then we'll talk how it becomes then a national holiday. But through the early 1800s, it's really a state holiday or a state event. And again, much more a day of solemnity. It does start to take on those traditions that we think of. But just as an example, from the Connecticut Current, a newspaper out of Hartford, Connecticut today, the Hartford Current, you see that in Massachusetts in 1821, Thanksgiving was going to be on the 6th day of December. And in New Hampshire, it was going to be on the 29th day of November. And in New York, 12th day of December. Just quick side note, that's Governor DeWitt Clinton, who many Midwestern states have Clinton County. And so that's where Clinton County gets its name, with the town of DeWitt is from DeWitt Clinton. He's the governor who promoted the Erie Canal. That's why he was so popular. But he set Thanksgiving in December. So a December Thanksgiving Day was not out of the ordinary in the pre-1860 period, especially pre-1850. By the 1860s, that classic New England or mid-Atlantic idea of Thanksgiving had come into popular culture. So it was often a time of travel where you would come home, visit family. I've seen stories of wayward children, almost prodigal sons, and stories, fiction stories, using Thanksgiving as a way to model appropriate Victorian behavior. So it really is, even as I will show you on our early Iowa proclamations, a day of solemnity and to a degree of celebration, but much more about worship and prayer originally, as you can see even on those notes that showed up in the Connecticut Current. And so here are three examples of Iowa proclamations on the left, three examples, and then a reference to President Lincoln's proclamation that becomes a national holiday in 1863. But these are our territorial proclamations from 1844, 1845, and 1846. Two of them by Territorial Governor John Chambers. Those are the two on the far left, and then the one on the right is from Territorial Governor James Clark. And I noted as I was doing this research, I've looked at these in the past, but even though the capital had moved to Iowa City, apparently the governor was still sitting in Burlington, for all these proclamations are issued out of Burlington, not Iowa City. And I thought that was interesting as I was looking at them. And so I'll pick the one on the bottom left for Governor Chambers. And, you know, it's a fairly terse proclamation saying, at the request of a number of citizens of the territory of Iowa, I, John Chambers, governor of the said territory, do hereby designate the last Tuesday in November as a day of public thanksgiving and praise to Almighty God for the blessings of the year now drawing to a close, and recommend its observance as such throughout the territory. And then it's just the officialness of the proclamation. So that's a nice little brief Thanksgiving proclamation. There's one above, and it's worth pointing out, these were often issued in October and then or early November so that it could be communicated across the state. And, you know, the territorial period, Polk County is not even really open for settlement at this point. So you're getting to maybe Iowa County and not much farther west. And by Iowa County, that would be the just east of Grinnell. So as you think about the territory, don't think about the whole state, think about the eastern third for the most part. And I would point out just on that 1844 proclamation, that's one of those where that's our first time we proclaim a territorial day of Thanksgiving is 1844. And Jennifer will send out an email with some references to some Annals of Iowa articles and other articles that have a nice history connected to this. But this is one where it's issued on October 12th. The actual date is going to be 2 months later on December 12th. So Territorial Governor Chambers is setting a December date for our very first territorial Thanksgiving. And there actually, I think, was one state Thanksgiving in the 1850s or early, the 1850s, I believe, that might have been in 1860s, where we had one other December Thanksgiving in the state of Iowa. So not a national day in that period until 1863. And then even after 1863, it was very rare for a national day of Thanksgiving to be proclaimed until a little bit later in the century. And so the editor of the Muscatine Courier must not have been a fan of President Lincoln. And you look at the notes, and this is where by 1860s, that last Thursday in November is typically the day that is set for Thanksgiving. And so saying the President of the United States and the Governor of Iowa have selected Thursday the 26th as a day for thanksgiving and praise. Now there are a great many ways that this day may be observed. And notwithstanding the wickedness and corruption which prevails in high places, there are a good many things to be thankful for. Though the President has violated his oath when he said, which he said was recorded in heaven, and has acted the petty tyrant over a people once free, yet we can thank God that it is no worse. Though shoddy contractors and army speculators and government officers are stealing as much as it ought to take to carry on the war, we can praise God and thank him because all is not stolen. Though ministers of the gospel and the sinless laity rob Southern mansions of family Bibles, libraries, and pianos, yet God should be praised because all the ministers and all the laity are not thus criminal. And it goes on. He actually then proposes, what should we do? And he's saying, we really ought to be not concerned about going and hearing abolition sermons, but we should celebrate by collecting materials and funds to help the needy. And so again, much like many of us are accustomed to the Red Kettle campaign of the Salvation Army. He's advocating to collect and provide funds to get provisions and other necessaries for the poor. So again, obviously not a Republican likely, and not a fan of the president, but here you see where a day of national Thanksgiving following Gettysburg and Vicksburg in the Civil War, and the war seems to be going better. So President Lincoln calls for that National Day of Thanksgiving in November 1863. So as you start to think about Thanksgiving through the 20th century, already the advocates for moving Thanksgiving not to the last Thursday of the month, but to the fourth Thursday of the month are coming into effect in 1916. And so here's we're not quite in World War I yet. And it was typical that the governor of Iowa would issue a Thanksgiving proclamation all through the late 1800s into the early 1900s. So here's Governor Clark. He's the grandfather of Niall Kinnock, where Niall Clark Kinnock gets his middle name. And he is being lobbied to move Thanksgiving not from the last Thursday, but up a week, so that there is more time to shop for a later holiday. And there's actually a nice little piece, and I misspoke. 1789, Washington is president. So that's day of Thanksgiving, the first time you see that. And then Lincoln's 63 and 64 proclamations too. And the story on Governor Clark is he is not in favor. And so when he does issue the proclamation, and I clipped it from the Des Moines Register of November 22nd, then it's a much similar proclamation. Following the Register leads with, following the example of President Wilson, Governor George W. Clark issued a proclamation designating Thursday, November 30th, as Thanksgiving Day, and again talks about the reason that we should be thanking God, and saying that last paragraph, that the people of Iowa may as a whole and at the same time in the customary way express their gratitude for the bountiful goodness of God and consider their obligations to him, to one another, the state and the world. I do hereby proclaim the day named by the president, Thursday, November 30th, as Thanksgiving Day in Iowa, and then in testimony thereof. And so this is one where, again, communication is much faster via telegraph and even telephone coming into common use in towns. So, and railroad communication, of course, too. So the governor isn't having to issue the Thanksgiving proclamation too far in advance. So just keep in mind that by 1916, there is the advocacy by commercial interests to say, we don't want Thanksgiving on the last Thursday of the month. We want it to be on the fourth Thursday of the month. And that comes to a head in the 1930s. You'll see an item from the museum collection. It's for a Thanksgiving Day dance on November 23rd in 1939 at the Billiken, which was a performance center in the Center Street, or a performance hall club in the Center Street neighborhood. This is from our Robert Patton collection, Des Moines printer, thriving Black community from the 19-teens into the 1950s, early 60s, until urban renewal and Interstate 235 really caused the demise of the Center Street neighborhood. So at the Billiken, they're going to have a Thanksgiving Day dance on November 23rd. But you look at the governor's proclamation, and it was contrary to what President Roosevelt had declared. And so 1939 is where President Roosevelt really does push for that federal holiday to shift to the fourth Thursday, but Iowa doesn't participate that first time. We set our Thanksgiving as November 30th that year. And things were a little different. So if you look in the article from the 26th, it says stores, banks, and most public offices throughout the state will be closed. Turkey dinners will be the order of the day in many Iowa homes. Some employees in the state will receive their second holiday in 2 weeks because banks, courts, and state liquor stores decided to close both Thanksgiving days to avoid legal complications. And then rural mail carriers took their holiday on the 23rd, says the article, but mail carriers in town are taking the 30th off, and that Governor Wilson is going to have his Thanksgiving then on the 30th down in Albia, where his family is living, and that most retail stores will be closed that day as well in Des Moines, and that many churches were planning Thanksgiving services is still typical in many denominations today. So 1939 is that last year where you see a split Thanksgiving in Iowa. And just transitioning then, today is the first day of Hanukkah. And Hanukkah will shift, of course, from a November or December start. It's based on the Hebrew calendar, and the month of Kislev, the 25th day based on the Jewish calendar, the 25th day of Kislev is when Hanukkah will start. So it will shift every year, but today is the first day of Hanukkah. And Iowa had Jewish populations going back to the 1850s. Dubuque is one of the first communities, but Davenport really has the first long sustained Jewish community in our state. And so you do see Hanukkah being referenced by the 1880s in Davenport newspapers. And the 1885, so it's in popular culture. Most Iowans were literate. We've historically been one of the most literate people in the state. I also noticed on that December 4th ad that's on the left of the screen, it's talking about holiday presents, not Christmas presents. So being very inclusive in the language. And then saying in that last paragraph, so the third paragraph down, the Feast of Hanukkah, or the Feast of Lights, observed by the Hebrews, closed last night. So Hanukkah is ending on December 3rd in 1885. And it's about the triumph of the Maccabees, or the Maccabees, and their triumph over the Syrians at the temple, and the second taking of the temple. And so saying that the day was spent in general festivities, particularly among the children who received presents and gave entertainments for their parents. So again, that idea of holidays is something that's being used in popular culture in the 1880s. It's not anything new talking about holidays. And then the Davenport Daily Times has a really great listing of a Hanukkah program. And you do see both spellings, as you can see in that article from the 1885. It's spelled with the H-A-N-N-U-K-A-H. With the CH is generally a little more common in the pre-1960 period. So if you're doing research in newspapers and using a digital searching mechanism, make sure you check both spellings and maybe some variants on the spellings with two Ks at the back or a KH, just to make sure. So a very formal program in 1887 with a song, a prayer, an address, recitation by Becky Goldstone. I didn't have a chance to see who the address by Reverend I. Fall is. Not sure that he is a rabbi. I would have think they would have designated that, but he may be the rabbi in Davenport. And then just seeing the list of programs throughout the day, music and essay, violin music, singing in German, the German Hanukkah song, and the list goes on, and concluding with a benediction. So you can see Jewish people have been celebrating Hanukkah in our state for generations, and really was struck by this as somebody who hadn't done a lot of research on Hanukkah until preparing for this program. But I suspect that it was a celebration that went back to the 19th century. I just didn't realize how rich some of the references we could find would be. So again, Davenport being one of the first really thriving Jewish communities in our state. But you do see celebrations then across the state in different communities. So a Sioux City Journal article from December 28th, 1902, saying that Rabbi Eugene Mannheimer will have Feast of Hanukkah sermon, and that will be at 10:45 for that service. And then article from Waterloo Courier from November 22nd, 1923. So as Jewish communities develop across our state, whether it be down in Ottumwa or up in Sioux City, Burlington, again, river towns, Dubuque, you would see Hanukkah being celebrated in their own ways in communities across our state. So a nice article from 1923 from Waterloo, talking about the celebration with candles will be lighted. So most of us know the 9-candle figure, sometimes called a menorah. Menorahs typically are the 7-candle candle holders. I think I have this right. The 9-candle candle holder is more properly called a menorah, and I would defer to anyone who's Jewish who listens, and if you're following along, you can correct me on that. But that's my understanding, is that the 9-candle candle holders is a slightly different name. And so really gives a review of what Hanukkah is and the festival of lights for the Jewish people. And so you see Hanukkah being observed through November and December as part of the celebration by the Jewish communities across our state. And so then by the 1950s, and actually in popular culture, you start seeing dreidels, the wood top, being referenced in popular articles, 1920s, 1930s. I just like this pair of photographs from the Des Moines Tribune of 1959, where it shows the two boys playing the game of dreidel, the top that is part of the celebration for children to learn some of the traditions of Hanukkah, and then the family lighting the candles on menorah there. So by the 1960s, post-World War II, it really is much like the celebration a lot of us are familiar with if you follow, if you have any friends who are Jewish or have followed the traditions of Hanukkah. So again, just to think about it that way, is that we have had Iowans who practiced the Jewish faith going back to the 1850s. That Hanukkah is being celebrated in our state, we know that, by the 1880s, and then more formalized, or I shouldn't say formalized, it was very formalized in the 1880s, but more familiar to what we know today by the World War II period. So really interesting to learn that aspect of the Jewish community's celebrations of Hanukkah in our state. And Kwanzaa is the most recent one of the holidays. It was actually started in 1966 by now PhD Milana Karinga, a professor in California. And he had grown up in California, had seen the racial strife and the Watts riots in the 1960s, and So in 1966, he created the Festival of Kwanzaa, meaning first fruits in Swahili, purposely picked a non-national or pan-national African language to create the Festival of Kwanzaa, and it runs December 26th through January 1st with a communal feast, Karumu, concluding the celebration. And it really was part of the Black self-awareness movement and to promote, self-improvement, self-support, community support through African-American communities, Black communities across the nation. And so starts in 1966. You do start to see it in the 1970s in central Iowa. The Register did a nice story in 1973. I would suspect that there were celebrations among some Black Iowans, especially in university communities, a little before this. I know from doing this research, Augustana College on the Illinois side of the Quad Cities has had a long-standing Kwanzaa celebration going back to the 1970s as a formal Kwanzaa event. And so a lot of the universities across the state with Black student unions picked up on celebrations fairly early. And you see what is still today, KUNI radio out of Cedar Falls, part of the University of Northern Iowa's broadcasting system at the time, but today part of Iowa Public Radio, that on Friday, December 27th, they were carrying a discussion, might have been a national feed. It's not truly specific, but December 27th, 1974, carrying a program on Kwanzaa as well. So again, entering popular culture in Iowa by the early 1970s. So really just 6 or 7 or 8 years after the celebration was created. And then through the 1970s, as I said, the Quad Cities, Iowa City, Ames, you see active celebrations being discussed, Des Moines as well. And by the 1980s, it's in most larger Iowa communities with larger Black populations. So the Cedar Rapids Gazette carries a nice article in 1986, the Des Moines Register in 1989. And so really getting, again, celebrated as a community event for Blacks across the state. And so the 1986 article references that the Iowa Afro-American Cultural Center at the University of Iowa is going to have a celebration. That was one of the things I noticed at the universities, was sometimes they would have their Kwanzaa events prior to the 26th because the student population would be gone by the 26th. Finals would have ended. So the note in that Cedar Rapids Gazette article says the university event is being held early before the start of Christmas vacation, said Sherry. However, many students are studying for final examinations at the time, and still others aren't familiar with Kwanzaa. So University of Iowa was going to host a celebration prior to the typical day. And again, the family being profiled in the Gazette, the Mealy family, they were originally from California, who'd come to Iowa City, Lynn County, and actually Johnson County in this case, where Leslie Mealy was attending law school. So again, sometimes people from outside the state who had that tradition. And so you see the group of 4 Black women, again, profiled in the 1989 article in the Register discussing Kwanzaa. And then Sioux City seems to have been a little bit later. Ms. Lee, who is pictured there on the right, she is a Sioux City woman, and her daughter had gone to Des Moines and had friends that celebrated Kwanzaa in Des Moines. Trela was her daughter. It is her daughter. I did some research, and Trela has moved back to the Sioux City area, I believe. But Trela had friends in Des Moines when she was living here, learned about Kwanzaa, talked to her mom about it. And so this is the first time, at least, that I could find that Kwanzaa is being discussed in the Sioux City area. I would not be surprised if there were Black families in Sioux City who had been celebrating Kwanzaa in the 1970s or the 1980s, but just seeing it depicted in popular culture again, that's been a little bit of what I've been trying to focus on our holidays today. And so struck by that. Ms. Flora Lee she makes a reference saying, sometimes things are a little slow, and I'm paraphrasing, but sometimes things are a little slow to come to Sioux City. I don't know that I always agree with that, but Sioux City has not had a historically large Black population, and the population of Sioux City is still just around 80,000. So it's stayed fairly stable. It's a little bit more than that. And the Black population really is not as large as in some of our other communities. I think there's around 3,000 Black residents in Sioux City proper today. So a very vibrant and thriving community, but not as large as maybe Waterloo, as we referenced, or Des Moines, and some of the other towns that we've referenced. And with that, we'll move to Christmas, and holiday that a lot of, whether you're Christian or not, most of us are familiar with. It's hard to avoid, and that was actually the case going back to the 1800s. It was hard to avoid Christmas even pre-1850. And so, and I don't mean to make light of Christmas either. It's just, it has always been almost, at least among, I shouldn't say always, gotta watch out for that, amongst certain Christians, Christmas has been a day of celebration. Often Lutherans and Catholics before Protestants like Methodists or Baptists or congregational traditions, and especially some of the more trying to think of how to phrase it, the traditional Protestant churches that really had a hard schism, and that's not to say that the Lutherans didn't have a hard schism with the Catholic Church, but when you look at the Methodists, those that came out of the Second Great Awakening, that's the way to think about it, perhaps, is they're the First and Second Great Awakening. So the Methodists, the Congregational Church, Episcopals, Catholics, Lutherans, those are some of the traditions. Depending on the Lutheran Synod, are going to be some of the traditions where you see it. So depiction of Christmas tree, and even a icon, it looks, of Mary and the Christ child on the wall in this home, which would be fairly unusual in a Protestant home. Maybe an Episcopal or a Catholic home would be a little more typical. And so the date on this is about 1819. John Lewis Krimmel was an artist out of Pennsylvania, and so mid-Atlantic area. And you see a small Christmas tree with some gifts on the table, a little stable yard. I don't know that that's a creche underneath the small Christmas tree, but some sort of stable yard there, and gifts on the table. So the idea of Christmas trees are out there in the 1810s and 1820s, though some religious traditions would have been vehemently opposed to the idea of Christmas on December 25th and having a celebration in the Mid-Atlantic, New England, and now the Midwestern states as we move west. But in New York, you do see the poem A Visit from St. Nicholas, published in a Troy, New York newspaper. The first illustration of in book form is 1854, and then 1862. So not only Christmas trees are coming into popular use, but you do see Santa Claus being depicted in a couple of the references on Christmas trees too that I wanted to make. You do see a German tree was placed in the White House by President Pierce in 1856. So that is where Christmas trees really start to become okay if the president has one, even though President Pierce isn't regarded, in the pantheon of the greatest presidents, he was still our nation's leader. And so by allowing a German tree in the White House in 1856, it becomes more normalized. And so you then see, as I said, A Visit from St. Nicholas being published as a poem in 1823. The idea of Santa Claus had been, or St. Nicholas had been popularized by Catholics going back to the Middle Ages with the Feast of St. Nicholas on December 6th. And then you see, and it's actually the New York Historical Society starts to use St. Nicholas as a little bit of a mascot and a patron saint, beginning at a fundraising dinner in 1810. And so there's a poster, what they would have historically called a broadside, with Santa Claus or St. Nicholas being depicted beginning in 1810. And so by 1823 in New York State, Santa Claus, St. Nicholas is a common figure. And you see Santa Claus being referenced in Iowa then in the 1850s, and holiday presents being referenced as well. On the lower left is the Santa Claus Depot being advertised in the Daily Iowa State Democrat in Davenport in 1857. So, he's not St. Nicholas, he's Santa Claus. So the elf figure, not a historical saint, that makes it a little more acceptable to Protestants. It becomes a caricature figure that to a degree we know today. It's not a saint coming from a Catholic tradition. And in the United States, especially the anti-Irish sentiment was very strong in the 1850s, and the Irish tended to be Catholic. And so calling him Santa Claus certainly makes it more acceptable. But you can see there's a Rock Island bookstore. This is during the panic, or the end of the panic of 1857, a terrible economic time in United States history. And so they're talking about hard times, but don't forget the holidays. Get out, come to our store and spend money and buy gifts and toys, and buy. So going back to the 1820s and 1830s, you really do see in states that precede Iowa, you see stores occasionally advertising Christmas items. And a lot of times they are books or stationery, not always toys, but that's becoming the case by the 1840s and the 1850s as Iowa is either a territory or a fairly new state. So pre-Civil War period, Christmas is going pretty solid in our state. And in fact, here's one of I used the image from Harper's Weekly on December 31st from 1864, but one of my favorite references from that I learned when I worked at Living History Farms, and Tom Moraine, the great historian who just passed away in October, had created a readers theater. So a bunch of us, when I was there, and it's a program they still have done, would travel, and I would not have normally been reading about Keturah Pinton Belknap. That would have been a woman. She was from a family down in Van Buren County, and this is her diary that another great historian, Glenda Riley, published in the Annals of Iowa. Glenda had transcribed it, and it was published in the Annals of Iowa. Excerpts were in the summer of 1977. So Keturah wrote, "Time passes on, and now it is time for the holidays. What will we have for Christmas dinner? For company, we'll have Father Belknap's and the Hawley family, and most likely the preacher, 12 in all. And now the bill of fare. What shall it be? No fruit for mince pies, no red apples to eat, no nuts to crack. They think I'm too young to get up a big dinner under the circumstances. All have gone to bed, so I will make out my bill of fare. Firstly, for bread, nice light rolls, cake, donuts. For pie, pumpkin, preserves, crab apples, and wild plums. Sauce, fried apples. Meat, first round, roast spare ribs with sausage and mashed potatoes, and plain gravy. Second round, chicken stewed with the best of gravy. Chicken stuffed and roasted in the Dutch oven by the fire. For then I had never cooked a meal on a stove. I think I can carry that out and have dinner by 2 o'clock if I get up early. I will cook in my room and set the table in the big room, and with both of our dishes can make a good showing. Everything went off in good style. Someone heard the old folks say they had no idea Kit could do so well. A lot of women are probably familiar with getting up early, and some men perhaps of getting up early to prepare your Christmas meal. Well, that was part of the tradition going back to our territorial period, where Keturah Pitton Belknap, she was a fairly young bride. She ended up moving to Oregon, but was living down in Van Buren County, as we said, and so that's her account of Christmas in December of 1841. Christmas was still something that was on Iowans' mind during the Civil War, and so the Burlington Hawkeye had printed a letter in early January 1863 from a soldier serving down near Vicksburg, and saying, well, Christmas has come and gone like many other Christmases of other years, but was not enjoyed by the boys in camp as they were before, although each one did his best to be as cheerful as though in their quiet homes in the great North. The day itself was as pleasant as one could wish, but the boys, as they gazed upon the bare, dry ground at their feet, which looked as though it might have been forever a stranger to snow, could not forbear looking wistfully to the north, while visions of broad sheets of snow and ice and grand sleigh rides and skating parties, together with turkeys, chicken pies, cakes, and delicacies at home, would seem to flit before their mind's eye. Yours, Newton J. Rogers, so member of the 15th Iowa Infantry, writing back, and much like soldiers through the generations, we've got a great photograph in the Historical Society's photographic collections that Becky Plunkett and Mary Bennett are the caretakers of soldiers during the Korean War at Christmas and New Year's Eve time. So certainly, again, a time when Iowa soldiers were thinking wistfully during the Civil War. And as we said, Santa Claus is going back to the 1820s, being popularized by Thomas Nast in the Harper's Weekly as the cartoon illustrator for Harper's Weekly. So you see in this 1866 depiction again, Santa Claus and his works, and he's got in the upper right his account book of the record of behavior of children. So, who's been naughty and nice, number of images depicting dolls making dolly clothes, a dolly tea, which dolly will you have, Christmas Eve image, and Santa at the Christmas tree in his workshop, and on the lookout on the left for good children. So again, a lot of those descriptions that you think of Santa today go back to the 1850s and 1860s with Santa Claus. But he was also popularized as part of the celebrations in Iowa communities. So East Central, Northeast Iowa, Jones County, Anamosa, 1872. This also comes out of Annals of Iowa. We'll send that as part of our references tomorrow, saying, the arrival of jolly old St. Nicholas, and that too in a big sleigh drawn by a golden caparisoned deer with lofty antlers and shining eyes and circled with jingling sleigh bells. Out clambered Santa Claus with his North Pole snowshoes and a shaggy coat, and made fast his beautiful steed to a convenient post. The children, and the old folks as well, were completely taken by surprise, for this part of the program had very happily been kept a profound secret by those who had the matter in hand. And so the surprise was as complete as it was delightful. So a nice account of Santa Claus arrival in Anamosa in 1872. In the same article, it's done by William Peterson on Christmas in Iowa goes on to say, another Jones County town, Onslow, the children were not so enamored by Santa Claus in Onslow, and so the visit by Santa Claus in Onslow was cut short in that Jones County town. Wanted to just talk about some other Iowa communities. So here's Bloomfield, Davis County, in the southeast, south central Iowa. That the Phoenix Hall has been procured for a Christmas Eve festival on December 24th for the benefit of the Congregational Church, and that a table of fancy articles to facilitate the operations of the coming man, Santa Claus, is to be an extensive affair. Committees are to canvass in a few days for that part of the stock and trade. Bloomfield and the country roundabout are invited to make a note of this. So essentially a church bazaar on Christmas Eve that is a chance if you need to do some last minute Christmas shopping or just want to plan on buying some Christmas items that the Congregational Church in Bloomfield in 1873 was going to be having a bazaar or a sale later that or the Christmas Eve. A couple other references from across the state and talking about Christmas trees and Christmas events. Excuse me. That the Episcopal Church was having Christmas Eve services with communion administered on Christmas Day. No Christmas festival that year. Or there will be a Christmas festival for the children of the Sunday school on Wednesday the 23rd. Then the Methodist Episcopal Church, part of what is today the United Methodist Church, was going to have a Christmas tree on Christmas Eve with appropriate exercises. Come one, come all. If you have presents for your friends, put them on the tree. Parents, don't forget your children, bring them along and be sure there's something on the tree for them. Please send old Santa Claus the names of all your children so that he will not miss them. So again, Santa Claus has become a common figure. And the Lamar's Daily Sentinel, or the Lamar Sentinel of December 30th, they didn't have a tree. The Methodist Episcopal Church had services that were pretty and enjoyable. The church was decorated with the usual effectiveness and taste, but instead of a tree, 2 large ladders were placed in the rostrum decked in white and branches of evergreens on which bags of candy and nuts were hung. The church was filled with a delighted audience. So another kind of heartwarming Christmas account from north central, northwest Iowa there. Of course, especially the Protestants were keenly aware that Christmas Day was not truly the day of Christ's birth. So the Eddyville Advertiser, December 26, 1874, had mentioned that Christmas is said to be the anniversary of the Nativity of Christ, the day when Christ was born. We believe it is now pretty generally conceded that this cannot be the day he was ushered into existence, but was chosen in conformity with heathen customs of having festivities in the wintertime. But this matters not. It has been selected as a season of gaiety and let all enjoy themselves, bearing in remembrance that charity which is due our fellow man. So again, that the Christmas season is a time of celebration and to remember the birth of Christ, but also to be a season of charity, as many of us think of it today. And a similar account from a Catholic church, Southwest Iowa, Creston, Union County. So most beautiful and impressive were the services at St. Malachi's Church on Christmas Day. The singing by the choir was superb, and while the day was not characteristic of the Christmas season, yet it was a beautiful day at St. Malachi's. The altars were a perfect bower of beauty and festoons of evergreen extended throughout the entire length of the vast edifice. The first Mass at 5 o'clock in the morning, celebrated by Father Michael. The children's Mass at 9 o'clock was said by the pastor, Reverend Father Bede, and the High Mass by Reverend Father Edward, with Father Michael as the deacon and Father Bede as the subdeacon, followed immediately by benediction. And so, again, denominations across the state really having this as one of the essentially high holy days, but Christmas and Easter being the 2 most important holy days in Christian churches. And wanted to wrap up just looking back at the Territorial period. And I was struck as I was doing this research by an article that ran in the Bloomington Herald. That was what Muscatine was known as into the 1840s, and then changed to Muscatine. And saying, this annual season of festivity, this allotted breathing spell from the cares and toils and the perplexities incident to human life, was observed by the good people of Bloomington on Wednesday last, with all those marks of friendship and good feeling which should ever characterize the return of this anniversary. Owing to the mildness of our Iowa climate, the day, as balmy and delightful as one could expect to witness in the month of May, was unmarked by the appearance of sleighs, buffalo robes, and the merry jingle of sleigh bells, with which our eyes and ears have been so often greeted in a colder climate, and which is the eye of the genuine son of New England, are so indispensably necessary to proper observance of the day. The houses of some of our citizens were thrown open to the calls of visitors, who were regaled with cakes, fruit, hot coffee, and etc., in a manner much to the credit of the hospitable entertainers and the pleasure of the entertained. Some of the more chivalrous and bloodthirsty among us, whose taste inclined them to martial exploits, and who, sick of these piping times of peace, desire some wider field of action than to caper nimbly in a lady's chamber, collected upon the island below our village for a wolf hunt. What success attended their labors, we are unable to say, though we believe no one was hurt, which was as much as could be reasonably expected from undisciplined soldiery. On Christmas Eve, a cotillion party was at the Iowa House, passed off most pleasantly, and was a fit leader to the festivities of the holidays. There was present a fair collection of ladies in all beauty and bloom and joy of youth, with hearts as merry as a marriage bell. The evening hours passed swiftly and delightfully along, and all separated at a seasonable hour, with mutual wishes for many like happy returns of this festive season. And such, readers, is the hearty wish of the editor to each of you. May this holiday season prove a happy one to you all. May the ensuing year prove to you more propitious than the one which has just passed away. May you live to see 1,000 happy years, and may your shadows never be less. And with the year that we've all had, I just thought, what a great sentiment to finish today's program. Excuse me. And with that, I want to say thanks for joining us today. And do have a little bit of time for questions. Sorry about that. And remind you that our next program coming up is going to be January 14th, 2021. Check out iowaculture.gov for that, or iowaculture.org.
Thank you, Leo. I think we all share your sentiments this year, especially. We have a few minutes to answer some questions at this time. However, before I pose the first question, I want to remind our participants that you can submit your questions to the Q&A. We are short on time, though, today. Please note, we may not be able to get to all your questions before we end the webinar. And Leo, I have a question that I think is interesting. In your research, have you come across any holiday traditions from the past that are no longer popular, or any favorites you might have found?
Oh gosh, there are still the handful of folks, I think, that will put out shoes outside their door or on a set of steps for Christmas anyway. I think that's St. Nicholas's feast day, if I remember right. That was one. My parents were both, my dad was raised Catholic. My mom was raised primarily Methodist. And so that was a tradition I heard as a boy in the 1970s that some folks still celebrate, but is not as common. And the whole 12 days of Christmas concept is one I think that most of us have not paid attention to, and there were a few communities. I didn't look for Boxing Day in Iowa. I'd be curious to see, like Lamar's did have a fairly decent number of Canadian immigrants, and so like to look and see if Boxing Day was ever something that had a presence in Iowa. It was something I heard of even as a boy, but was certainly second, not even second. It was far behind Christmas for most Iowa communities.
So another thing I love about the holidays is food, and we had some great food descriptions in this program. But why do you think food is so important for holiday celebrations and traditions?
Yeah, I really do. Food is one of those traditions that family members pass on to each other. And so it's part of that connection to, whether it be a mother or a grandmother who had a recipe. And then the communal activity of, perhaps going to some sort of services, whether it be a Hanukkah service, a church service, where you celebrate the traditions of your community and your culture, and then gather with family at a communal dinner that becomes a little more difficult, I think, or less important. I don't know that it's more difficult. We culturally made the decision that sitting down to a meal is not as common as it used to be, and so the idea of Christmas and Thanksgiving and in other cultures, as you saw with Kwanzaa, a feast being part of that tradition on January 1st, and for Jewish Iowans, the foods of the Hanukkah season are important too. So I think that connection to your culture and your family's history really helps cement those food traditions.
Well, thank you, Leo. And actually, with that answer, this is all the time we have for today's webinar. And I said this before, and I'll say it again, but it's an informative lunch. I learned a lot today. Also, thank you to everyone joining us. We hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History 101 webinar. Our next one, again, is on January 14th. There are many great stories from Iowa's past to tell in the upcoming months. For more information and to register for future webinars in our series, check out our website at iowaculture.gov. This webinar and past presentations are available on our website as well. And if you're looking for other things to do, while you're there, you can look into some of our other fantastic digital programs, such as the Goldie's Kids Club activities for young historians, or watch video recordings of the Iowa Stories series, which is hosted by our Iowa City branch, or even recordings of our past Iowa History 101 series as well. Thank you all again for joining us today. Have a great afternoon. Look forward to virtually seeing you all next year, and happy holidays from all of us here at the State Historical Society of Iowa. Thank you.